Imagine for a moment the foundational beliefs of your life.
Right.
Just really picture them. The core values, the unspoken rules, the deeply held truths you were raised with from the time you could barely speak. I want you to picture those beliefs as a grand protective tent.
Like a massive canopy.
Yeah, exactly. A massive, beautiful, intricate shelter shielding you from the harsh, chaotic, and frankly terrifying elements of the world outside. And under this tent, you know exactly who you are. You know exactly how you're supposed to behave, what your future looks like, and precisely where you belong in the social hierarchy. It feels undeniably safe. But what happens when you start to grow?
Right. What happens when you look up?
Yes. What happens when you look up one day and realize that this grand tent, this all-encompassing protective shelter, is starting to feel less like a sanctuary and a whole lot more like a cage?
It is a profound, incredibly disorienting, and often terrifying realization. Because when you finally recognize the boundaries of that cage, you are immediately forced to make a seemingly impossible choice. Do you consciously shrink yourself down, basically ignoring your own developmental growth to continue fitting inside that predetermined space? Or do you start pulling up the stakes?
Knowing full well that taking down your section of the tent might bring the entire structure crashing down on top of you.
And everyone you love.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a process that is incredibly complex, frequently agonizing, but deeply, deeply transformative for those who navigate it. We're talking about the intersection of deconstruction and the family.
It's a heavy one today.
It is. We're going to look really closely at what happens when the internal self outgrows the external structures it inherited, particularly within the highly pressurized, high-stakes environment of the religious family system.
And we have an incredibly rich, nuanced stack of source material to guide us today. Our analysis is rooted entirely in the extensive research and clinical writings of Dr. Dorothy W. Parker.
She's a leading scholar in religious philosophy, family systems, and psychology, right?
Yes, she is. And we are synthesizing insights from 4 of her foundational works today. So that's 4 paths to deconstructing religion, deconstructing religious families, deconstructing the sacred canopy, and her latest book, Deconstruction, Breaking the Agreements That Built Your Life.
That last title is just so good.
It really is. Dr. Parker has basically dedicated her entire academic focus to understanding the sheer mechanics of how individual authenticity collides with family systems theory and religious sociology.
So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack what Dr. Parker brilliantly calls the intricate architecture of the self. We want to distinguish between the internal, private process of deconstructing your personal beliefs and the messy, highly relational process of deconstructing your family dynamic.
Which people constantly confuse.
Totally. And most importantly, we want to guide you through Dr. Parker's framework for moving from a state of enforced conformity, living a life that was essentially handed to you on a script, to what she identifies as a sovereign, authentic life.
But before we dive into the architecture of that transition, this raises a really important question about the parameters of our discussion today and our role as guides through this material.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because we need to make something explicitly clear to you, our listener, right from the jump.
Yeah.
This show is not taking a stance on the validity, the truth claims, or the morality of any specific religious beliefs or institutions.
Right.
Whether you personally lean left, right, or center politically, and whether you are a deeply devout believer, a staunch atheist, or somewhere entirely in between, our purpose in this deep dive is to impartially report on Dr. Parker's sociological and psychological analysis of the deconstruction experience.
We are just conveying the ideas.
Exactly, of the frameworks, the clinical research found in her original source material. We are not endorsing or condemning a specific worldview. We are strictly exploring the mechanics of a deeply human psychological and relational phenomenon.
Precisely. We are examining the invisible architecture of belief and belonging, not auditing the theological content of those beliefs. And to truly understand that architecture, we have to start with the environment we are born into.
The starting line.
Right. This brings us to a concept that is absolutely foundational to Dr. Parker's work, which she adapts from the sociologist Peter Berger, and that is the concept of the sacred canopy.
The tent metaphor we started with.
Yes. Berger originally proposed that religion functions as a comprehensive, overarching canopy over human society. It's a framework of meaning, order and cosmic stability that basically helps individuals make sense of their existence, their suffering, and the unpredictable nature of the universe.
Okay, let's unpack this because the metaphor is doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
Yeah.
A canopy provides shelter. It keeps the rain off.
Mm.
In Berger's sociological model, and as utilized by Dr. Parker, this sacred canopy acts as a robust psychological and emotional shelter from the sheer existential chaos of the world. It dictates the moral parameters, the daily practices, and the ultimate purpose of a community. Under the canopy, nothing is random.
Everything has a divine reason.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here is the underlying structural reality of this canopy. Dr. Parker emphasizes that from a sociological standpoint, this sacred canopy is fundamentally an abstract human-made construct.
Right. It is not an inherent, immutable physical reality like gravity or thermodynamics.
Its immense power, its very real ability to dictate how people live, who they marry, how they raise children, and how they perceive reality, relies entirely on collective consensus.
The canopy only stays suspended if everyone standing underneath it agrees to hold up their designated pole.
I love that visual. And that collective consensus operates through what Dr. Parker terms social agreements. I want to linger on this because it's so central to the conflict of deconstruction. We're all born into pre-organized worlds.
We don't start with a blank slate.
Never. Long before you or I had the language, the cognitive agency, or the critical thinking skills to evaluate our environment, we were handed a blueprint for reality. These social agreements are the rules.
Both the explicitly articulated dogmas and the deeply unspoken behavioral norms.
Yeah, they dictate what is acceptable, what is sacred, what is profoundly taboo, and what behaviors will incur social punishment.
Because these agreements are introduced so early in human development, woven into family dynamics, cultural rules, language patterns, and foundational religious stories, they become completely invisible to the child.
You just absorb them.
Completely. We don't perceive them as arbitrary agreements that our ancestors consented to. We perceive them as the absolute objective nature of reality. Dr. Parker argues that this uncritical absorption leads to the creation of what she calls the borrowed self.
The borrowed self.
Right. Long before we have the capacity for self-determination, we are given a preset identity to inhabit.
That phrase is just so evocative. You are essentially issued a uniform. You absorb the rules about which emotions are safe to express, which questions are categorized as dangerous or rebellious, and which specific identities will secure reward, love, and protection from your family and your community.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of moral development, it completely redefines how we understand the concept of being good.
How so?
Well, Dr. Parker points out that what many individuals within these high control systems consider their deep, personal moral compass is, in fact, borrowed morality.
Wow.
The religious family system functioning under this sacred canopy effectively teaches the child to equate morality with strict conformity. Being a good person simply means seamlessly upholding the values that the system endorses, thereby securing your continued acceptance and safety within that system.
But wait, if someone is just equating goodness with conformity, isn't that essentially reducing human identity to a long-term social performance?
Yeah.
You aren't actually developing a self. You're just playing a role. The devout congregant, the perfectly obedient child, the submissive spouse. I can see how those roles offer an incredible amount of predictability and a deep sense of belonging, which humans absolutely crave.
We are wired for it.
We really are. But the cost is massive. It requires you to actively, constantly suppress your authentic inner world to maintain the comfort of the collective.
It does, and the mechanism that enforces this suppression is groupthink. As anyone familiar with social psychology knows, groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony, cohesion, and consensus within a group entirely overrides realistic appraisal and critical thinking.
Right.
In the context of the sacred canopy, groupthink isn't just a cognitive bias. It is the primary enforcement mechanism of those social agreements. It is the immune system of the canopy, designed to attack anything that threatens the consensus.
And the pressure that immune system exerts is staggering. If you are deeply embedded in an environment driven by groupthink, you feel this overwhelming, palpable demand to align.
You feel it in the room.
You really do. You learn very quickly that to avoid conflict, or to avoid being labeled a troublemaker, or worse, a heretic or a disappointment, you must engage in rigorous self-censorship. You actively swallow your doubts. You bury your differing opinions. You perform the expected reality.
Because the alternative is sociologically terrifying. Drawing on social identity theory, Dr. Parker reminds us that people derive a massive portion of their psychological stability from the groups they belong to.
Groupthink solidifies this allegiance by creating a rigid us versus them dichotomy.
Exactly. Outsiders, or more importantly, anyone within the in-group who begins to express a differing view, are immediately stereotyped as threats to the collective survival.
Which creates an environment of intense self-surveillance.
Yes. Individuals are terrified to harbor unique thoughts because the perceived penalty is being ostracized, alienated, and stripped of their social and existential protection. It results in a profound atrophy of the true self.
I want you, the listener, to stop and reflect on that dynamic for a second. Think about your own life. Have you ever performed a role just to maintain the ambient comfort of your social or family circle?
Most people have.
Have you ever sat at a holiday dinner table or in a pew and simply nodded along to a conversation or a belief that you fundamentally, internally disagreed with, purely because the social cost of speaking up felt too dangerous?
That is the power of the borrowed self.
That is the sacred canopy demanding consensus.
And many individuals can perform that role for a very long time, for decades. Sometimes for their entire lives, convinced that the low-grade hum of anxiety they feel is just the normal human condition.
But for others, it breaks.
Yes, a fracture inevitably begins to form. The external life they inherited no longer fits the internal intelligence and awareness they are developing. And this brings us to the actual catalyst of deconstruction. How does the dismantling of the borrowed self actually begin?
Here's where it gets really interesting, and where Dr. Parker's clinical observations challenge a lot of assumptions. You would naturally think that deconstructing a highly complex system of religious or familial belief would initiate as a massive intellectual debate, right?
Right, that's the stereotype.
The stereotype is someone sitting in a library, poring over dense theological texts or historical documents, finding a glaring logical contradiction and making a rational, calculated decision to leave the faith. But Dr. Parker's work highlights a profoundly different reality. Deconstruction, for the vast majority of people, doesn't start in the intellect.
It starts in the nervous system.
It begins somatically. The body registers a profound misalignment long before the conscious mind is willing to authorize the thought.
Dr. Parker's clinical research demonstrates that the physical body becomes the site of the very first protest against these inherited social agreements.
The intellect is often too heavily guarded by cognitive biases and fear to see the fracture. But the nervous system cannot be intellectualized away.
It manifests physically and often aggressively. We are talking about chronic anxiety, unexplained exhaustion, a sudden visceral inability to continue performing the expected roles.
Dr. Parker gives us examples of patients who experience a literal tightness in their chest or shallow breathing the moment they walk into a familiar religious building.
Or a wave of deep, bone-weary fatigue when they are expected to recite a creed or lead a prayer they've said 1,000 times before.
The body is essentially throwing the emergency brake and saying, I physically cannot pretend anymore.
What's fascinating here is how this physiological rebellion is almost universally misinterpreted by the individual experiencing it. When the nervous system protests, people rarely possess the framework to recognize it for what it is.
Because they are still operating completely under the borrowed morality of the sacred canopy.
Exactly. They interpret this bodily resistance as a moral or spiritual failure. They internalize it. They think, I am not strong enough. I am not disciplined enough. My faith is weak. I am under spiritual attack.
Right, they view themselves as the broken component in a perfect machine. They think they're failing the system, rather than realizing the system is suffocating them. I love how Dr. Parker frames this. She notes that the body does not measure worth through effort. It measures truth through alignment.
That's a powerful distinction.
This bodily protest is not a signal of weakness or lack of discipline. It is a profound, incredibly healthy signal that the internal architecture of the self is outgrowing the external structure of the life surrounding it. You're outgrowing the pot you were planted in, and your expanding roots are starting to crack the ceramic.
Which plunges the individual into an excruciating psychological state that Dr. Parker describes as identity in tension. In clinical terms, it is a kind of psychological double exposure. You are attempting to hold two entirely incompatible worlds in your mind at the exact same time.
There's the world you were conditioned to uphold, the inherited self, the expectations of your parents, the dogma of your community.
And then there is the world your inner architecture is beginning to perceive as true, the emerging, authentic self.
It is the ultimate liminal space, and it sounds like pure psychological torture. You are suspended in the void between two realities. You haven't fully dismantled the old identity. You still have the vocabulary, the relationships, the muscle memory, the religion, but you can no longer comfortably inhabit it either.
And the emotional toll of navigating this double exposure is immense. You end up feeling like you are betraying absolutely everyone.
That sense of pervasive betrayal is twofold, which compounds the agony. On one hand, you feel intensely disloyal to your old identity and your family because you are privately, secretly questioning the absolute foundations of everything they hold sacred.
You feel like a fraud in their midst.
On the other hand, you feel a deep, agonizing disloyalty to your own emerging authentic self because you are still going through the motions, participating in roles, rituals, and conversations that actively suppress your newly discovered truth. You are caught in a relentless internal tug of war.
And while your nervous system is sounding the alarm and your identity is stretching to the breaking point, your mind goes into absolute overdrive trying to mitigate the discomfort. The cognitive dissonance here is staggering.
It is the defining feature of this stage. When an individual holds deeply contradictory beliefs, or when their emerging internal values violently clash with the religious teachings deeply ingrained by their family system, the psychological discomfort is intolerable.
The mind simply cannot abide that level of dissonance for long.
So the mind attempts to protect the old identity to stop the pain. It starts generating elaborate rationalizations. I think anyone who's been through this or witnessed it knows exactly what this looks like. You try to twist logic, you heavily reinterpret doctrines to soften their edges, or you create massive internal narratives to make the old rigid framework somehow fit your new expansive awareness.
You tell yourself things like, well, the leadership doesn't really mean it that way.
Or I'll just focus on the community service aspect and ignore the harmful theology. Dr. Parker notes that the mind fears the collapse of meaning far more than it fears the distortion of truth.
And this frantic attempt to patch the cracking canopy is where Dr. Parker issues a very strong clinical warning about a phenomenon first conceptualized by psychologist John Wellwood, known as spiritual bypass.
Okay, we need to dig into this. What exactly is spiritual bypass in the context of deconstruction, and why is it so dangerous?
Spiritual bypass is the unconscious tendency to use spiritual beliefs, practices, or newly adopted enlightened frameworks to avoid dealing with unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, or unfinished developmental tasks.
Avoidance, basically.
Total avoidance. When an individual is in the throes of deconstruction, the sheer terror of facing the trauma of their religious socialization or the impending catastrophic loss of their family community is so overwhelming that the psyche looks for an escape hatch.
Rather than doing the agonizing, messy, emotional work of grieving and dismantling, they bypass it.
They might suddenly adopt a superficial, hyper-positive love and light spirituality, or cling to a new, progressive philosophical framework with the exact same dogmatic rigidity they used in their old religion. They substitute one performance of certainty for another, completely avoiding the painful emotional void.
It's like putting a beautifully decorated, spiritually themed Band-Aid over a deep infected wound. It looks nice on the outside, you can tell everyone you're healed and evolving, but underneath, the trauma and the familial enmeshment are still festering.
You actually have to clean out the wound, no matter how excruciating it is, to confront the reality of your family dynamics.
And that brings us to the actual practical work of deconstruction, which Dr. Parker splits into two very distinct, often conflicting fronts.
This distinction is perhaps one of the most vital, clarifying insights in Dr. Parker's entire body of research. People constantly conflate leaving a religion with leaving a religious family, treating them as a single event. But Dr. Parker argues they are entirely different processes, requiring completely different psychological tools, pacing, and emotional capacities.
Let's break down the difference, because conflating them seems to be where most people get utterly derailed. Deconstructing religion is a deeply personal, internal process. It is a cognitive, intellectual, and solitary dismantling of doctrines, theology, historical claims, and metaphysical beliefs.
It's you, alone in your head or with your books, wrestling with abstract ideas, ancient texts, and existential concepts of God or the universe.
Conversely, deconstructing religious families is highly relational, external, and interpersonal. It is about navigating the complex, often highly volatile emotional dynamics that arise when that shared religious framework, the sacred canopy that dictated every family interaction, is no longer present to unify the system.
You are no longer dealing with abstract theology. You are dealing with your mother's tears, your father's anger, and your siblings' judgment.
To really understand why deconstructing the family is so explosive, we have to look through the lens of family systems theory, particularly the work of Murray Bowen. This is crucial for understanding the blast radius of deconstruction.
Bowen suggested that families do not operate as collections of independent individuals. They operate as highly interconnected emotional units.
Everyone is linked.
If one person shifts their position, the entire mobile tilts, and the system immediately tries to force that person back into their original position to regain balance. This is known as homeostasis.
And within highly religious families, religion is not merely a Sunday morning activity. It is the central organizing principle of the entire family structure. It dictates the moral values, the strict gender roles, the acceptable career paths, and the ultimate metrics of success.
Bowen's theory introduces the incredibly helpful concept of triangles. When interpersonal tension or conflict arises between two family members, a third entity is inevitably drawn in to stabilize the relationship and diffuse the anxiety.
In religious families, religion itself, the shared dogma, the ultimate authority of the text or the pastor, frequently serves as that stabilizing third leg of the triangle.
Let's ground this with a concrete example. Imagine a parent and an adult child who, underneath it all, have terrible communication skills and a deep well of unresolved historical resentment.
Okay, picturing it.
But they both deeply believe in the exact same religious text and attend the same congregation. That shared belief acts as a massive buffer. It suppresses the interpersonal conflict. They can bond over church activities, they can use religious language to bypass real intimacy, and the shared dogma masks the underlying dysfunction.
But the moment the adult child deconstructs their beliefs and actively removes that religion leg of the triangle boom, the structure instantly collapses.
Exactly. When you deconstruct your beliefs, you fundamentally destabilize the entire family equilibrium. You remove the buffer, and this process inevitably brings all the historically hidden dysfunctions violently to the surface.
Issues of intense control, emotional manipulation, unmet psychological needs, covert narcissism, or long-standing childhood trauma, things that were previously justified, spiritualized, or completely obscured by the religious framework, are suddenly laid bare.
The family can no longer say, "We're just following God's will." They are forced to confront their actual relational dynamics.
Which presents anyone going through this with a massive, paralyzing chicken or egg dilemma. Dr. Parker dedicates a significant portion of her research to this exact predicament. Should you deconstruct the abstract religion first, getting your theological house in order, or should you deconstruct the messy family dynamics first?
If you are standing at the crossroads, which path do you take to survive the process?
It's the question every individual in this situation agonizes over. Dr. Parker emphasizes that there is no universal one-size-fits-all answer, because every family system has a different level of toxicity. However, she outlines very distinct pros and cons to each approach, and notes that the sequence you choose matters immensely to your psychological survival. Let's look at the first option.
Deconstructing religion first.
Right. So if you tackle the religion first, you are focusing intensely on your personal internal beliefs. You are reading the critical scholarship, questioning the historical claims, dismantling the theology in private. The pros of this path seem pretty clear. You establish an incredibly strong, independent sense of self.
You figure out what you actually believe.
Independent of your family's pervasive influence. Before you ever attempt to bring these explosive topics to the Thanksgiving dinner table, you build your internal armor first.
The intellectual armor is strong, yes, but the cons of that approach are relationally significant. If you privately deconstruct your entire worldview over the course of 2 years and then suddenly reveal to your highly enmeshed religious family that you no longer share their core identity, you invite an incredible amount of relational fallout all at once.
From their perspective, it is a sudden, unprovoked betrayal.
If you haven't prepared for the sheer emotional blowback, if you haven't established relational boundaries beforehand, the sudden family conflict can be absolutely devastating, often leading to deep trauma and immediate, messy isolation.
It's like dropping a bomb without having built a bunker. So what about the other way around? What if you look at Bowen's triangles and decide to deconstruct the family dynamics first before finalizing your thoughts on God or the universe?
This approach requires critically examining how religious beliefs are weaponized or embedded in your family relationships before you finalize your theological positions. You might go to therapy to address underlying issues of parental control, the use of guilt as a motivator, and the conditional nature of your family's acceptance.
The primary pro here is risk mitigation.
By addressing the relational dysfunctions, learning to communicate effectively, and establishing some basic healthy boundaries first, you might create a slightly more stable, differentiated environment. Then you can eventually explore your personal beliefs without the immediate threat of total familial collapse.
But the cons of that approach seem equally daunting. How do you critically and objectively examine the validity of your religious beliefs while you are still deeply enmeshed in the emotional expectations and weekly rituals of your family?
It seems incredibly difficult to see the forest when you are emotionally handcuffed to the trees.
The pressure to conform while you are trying to heal the relationship might just pull you right back under the canopy.
That is the exact risk. The overarching takeaway from Dr. Parker's empirical evidence is that strong religious family systems causally impact the deconstruction process. You cannot separate the two.
The deep attachment bonds and years of socialization complicate the intellectual journey immensely.
A family's reaction, whether they are surprisingly supportive or aggressively hostile, can dramatically accelerate an individual's growth or severely, traumatizingly hinder their ability to navigate their own beliefs.
And speaking of the variables that violently impact this journey, there's a massive one we need to address, which Dr. Parker outlines brilliantly: age and stage of life. Because deconstructing a family system at 15 years old is a vastly fundamentally different experience than deconstructing at 45.
Age and life stage play a profound, deterministic role in both an individual's ability to challenge familial dynamics and the severity of the consequences for doing so. Let's begin with the most vulnerable demographic: childhood and adolescence.
During this stage, the stakes of deconstruction are, quite frankly, impossibly high.
They really are. When you are a child or a teenager, you are totally dependent on your family system for your basic survival. Financially, emotionally, physically, you rely on the people who are enforcing the sacred canopy.
During this time, your family's religious beliefs are being deeply ingrained into your neurobiology through constant socialization, fear of hell, or promises of divine reward.
Furthermore, from a developmental psychology standpoint, younger individuals are still actively developing their frontal lobes and cognitive critical thinking skills. They generally lack the broader life experience, the historical context, and the exposure to diversity required to effectively evaluate alternative worldviews.
They only know the water they are swimming in.
But teenagers are naturally wired for rebellion and individuation. So if an adolescent does begin to question the sacred canopy, if they start seeing the hypocrisy or feeling that somatic misalignment we discussed earlier, the risk they take by speaking up is severe.
Openly deconstructing beliefs when you still live under your parents' roof carries a devastating risk of alienation. Dr. Parker's case studies highlight teenagers facing complete social isolation from their youth groups, intense emotional pressure from parents, forced meetings with clergy, or in extreme cases, being completely ostracized or expelled from the home.
The psychological toll of this conditional love is profound, which is why many young people are forced to deeply suppress their doubts, essentially fracturing their own psyche, just to survive until they turn 18.
As individuals transition into young adulthood, moving into their 20s, the landscape changes significantly, though it remains fraught. Increased geographical and financial independence creates a much safer, broader environment for exploration.
Young adults are naturally exposed to peer influence outside their religious circle, higher education, different cultural norms, and new philosophical frameworks.
These external factors frequently catalyze the deconstruction process that may have been suppressed during adolescence.
Right, you finally move out, you go to a university or get a job in a new city, and suddenly you realize the sacred canopy isn't the only tent in town. You can actually explore, read forbidden books, or skip a religious service without the immediate, daily, panopticon-like oversight of your family.
But, and this is a massive but, in Dr. Parker's research, the emotional tension remains palpable. You might have physical distance, but the psychological enmeshment is still deeply active.
Navigating the excruciating tension of disappointing your parents while finally pursuing your own authenticity is an incredibly heavy burden for a young adult trying to establish their life.
Which brings us to the complexities of full adulthood. One might logically assume that mature adults possessing established autonomy, complete financial independence, and robust external support networks would find deconstructing religious families to be a relatively straightforward, if unpleasant, process.
But Dr. Parker's clinical research reveals a landscape fraught with complex, unique, and deeply painful challenges.
Exactly. Adults have established independent lives, but they also have deep, long-standing emotional bonds with their families of origin. Breaking a foundational social agreement that you've actively upheld for 30 or 40 years generates intense, profound guilt.
It can feel like a devastating betrayal of your roots, a rejection of your parents' legacy, and a repudiation of all the sacrifices they made for you.
Furthermore, adults face the incredibly complicated logistics of navigating extended family expectations regarding their own children. This is where the theoretical hits the intensely practical. If you deconstruct, how do you handle the devout grandparents who fully expect and aggressively demand that your children be raised within the family's specific religious traditions?
You are no longer just navigating your own personal identity crisis. You are actively acting as a shield and a buffer for the next generation, trying to break generational cycles of high-control religion without severing the grandparent-grandchild bond.
It's a logistical and emotional nightmare. But Dr. Parker notes that the absolute most complex, volatile variable in adulthood is deconstructing within a marriage.
This is where the pain can be the sharpest, because you aren't just renegotiating with your parents. You are renegotiating the foundational contract of your daily life.
Many individuals in these high-control systems entered into marriages explicitly built upon the concept of religious homogamy.
Yes, religious homogamy refers to marriages where shared religious beliefs, identical theological values, and joint participation in religious rituals serve as the absolute foundational bedrock of the relationship.
Sociological research consistently shows that this shared foundation provides immense stability regarding major life choices, decision-making paradigms, child-rearing philosophies, and moral guidance. The marriage is essentially a subtent within the sacred canopy.
So, what happens to that stability when one partner begins to deconstruct and the other remains firmly, devoutly planted under the sacred canopy?
Dr. Parker's accounts of this are absolutely devastating. It immediately introduces a profound existential fear of divorce. The deconstructing partner often experiences severe emotional isolation within their own home.
They feel entirely vulnerable, terrified of facing harsh spiritual sanctions within the marriage, or terrified that their spouse will view them as having broken the fundamental, sacred contract of their union.
They are suddenly married to someone who views their genuine growth as a tragic spiritual rebellion.
The communication breakdowns in these mixed-faith marriages can be severe and rapid. If the devout partner feels their core values are under attack or believes that the deconstructing partner is abandoning them spiritually and eternally, it leads to deep, entrenched defensiveness.
Every conversation becomes a theological battleground, and the primary, most painful battleground invariably becomes child-rearing.
The deconstructing partner may no longer want to impose rigid, dogmatic beliefs or purity culture on the children, while the devout partner feels an absolute, terrifying moral imperative to save their children's souls. It is a state of constant, agonizing, high-stakes tension.
But amidst all this bleakness, Dr. Parker does offer hopeful extrapolation based on her clinical research. While the risk of divorce is undeniably higher in these mismatched scenarios, adaptation and survival are entirely possible.
A faith crisis is not an automatic, predetermined death sentence for the marriage.
Indeed, it is not. Couples who successfully navigate this immense seismic shift often do so by fundamentally renegotiating the role of religion within the marriage itself.
This requires incredibly open, deeply non-judgmental dialogue, almost always facilitated by a skilled couples therapist who understands religious transitions.
It requires the monumental task of moving from a marital foundation built on shared dogma and assumed consensus to a completely new foundation built on mutual respect for each other's individual, differing spiritual journeys.
It is extraordinarily difficult, ego-dismantling work, but it is achievable if both partners value the relationship over the need for theological agreement.
Which brings us out of the immediate home and into the broader family arena, where the expectations of the collective hit you full force. Let's step into what Dr. Parker accurately labels the relational minefield. We need to talk about boundaries, the social cost of changing, and the ultimate pressure cooker, the holidays.
There is perhaps no crucible more intense, no environment more triggering for a deconstructing individual than major holidays and significant family life events, such as weddings, baptisms, or funerals.
Just think about your own extended family gatherings. Holidays like Christmas, Passover, Ramadan, Easter, or Diwali, they're not just times to eat food. They are heavily, inextricably embedded with religious rituals and familial expectations.
When you gather with a highly religious and meshed family, the unspoken expectation is total, seamless conformity. Everyone bows their head to pray, everyone attends the specific religious service, everyone enthusiastically participates in the tradition without questioning it.
For someone who is in the process of deconstructing or who has completely left the faith, this intense social pressure to conform triggers severe mental strain. The cognitive dissonance we discussed earlier peaks dramatically during these events.
You are surrounded by the people you ostensibly love most in the world, sitting in your childhood home, but you feel like a complete imposter.
The visceral fear of being judged, criticized, or becoming the target of an impromptu intervention forces many to hide their true beliefs, which only exacerbates profound feelings of isolation, resentment, and inauthenticity.
So, what is the practical advice here? What do you actually do? Do you just boycott Thanksgiving forever? Dr. Parker offers some very practical, field-tested strategies here. She strongly advises a concept she calls selective participation.
Selective participation is a boundary-setting tool where you intentionally choose to engage deeply with the secular, purely relational, or culturally significant aspects of a family gathering, while politely but firmly excusing yourself from the explicitly religious rituals.
You might joyfully attend the holiday dinner, participate in the gift exchange, and help cook the meal, but you intentionally opt out of attending the midnight church service or abstain from leading the corporate prayer. You are present for the family, but absent for the dogma.
But Dr. Parker emphasizes a critical caveat here. You cannot wait until the turkey is literally on the table and everyone is holding hands to announce your selective participation. That is a recipe for a massive dramatic blowout.
She stresses the absolute necessity of communicating your limits well in advance. You have to call or email your family before the event, when everyone's nervous systems are relatively calm, to state your boundaries.
This reduces the in-the-moment pressure, manages their expectations, and avoids a highly theatrical, emotional confrontation in front of the mashed potatoes.
And anticipating that confrontation leads us directly to the broader social cost of awakening. If we connect this to the bigger picture of human sociology, we have to return to the idea that identity within a sacred canopy functions primarily as a social contract. Every single relationship in these high-control communities rests on mutually reinforced, deeply conditional expectations.
It's the unspoken deal. You be this way, I'll be that way. We will both validate each other's choices, and we'll all feel safe and comfortable.
Precisely. And without ever explicitly stating it, enmeshed communities implicitly demand that you stay the same for their collective comfort and validation. Your conformity is the mirror they use to assure themselves they are right.
When you awaken, when you begin to deconstruct and change your behaviors, you stop performing the predictability that made you manageable and reassuring to the group. You shatter their mirror.
And the reaction from the group to that shattered mirror exposes a very, very painful truth. Awakening exposes the fact that your belonging, which you thought was based on unconditional love, was actually highly conditional. It was conditional upon your absolute conformity to the social agreements.
When you change, loved ones may try to use heavy guilt, dire spiritual warnings, or emotional appeals to tradition to bring you back into alignment.
Dr. Parker is careful to note they aren't necessarily being malicious or evil. They are genuinely terrified of the disruption to their own collective identity and deeply afraid for your soul.
But for the individual deconstructing, the result is the same. It devastatingly reveals the stark difference between a relationship rooted in genuine mutual respect for who you are and a relationship rooted in mutual conformity to what you believe.
This deeply painful dynamic is beautifully and academically illustrated in Dr. Parker's analysis of assimilation versus multiculturalism within family structures. In highly religious and meshed families, there is almost always a powerful unspoken drive toward assimilation. The strict expectation that all members must adopt the dominant religious norms, political views, and values of the parents, often at the complete expense of their original or evolving individual identity.
It's essentially ethnocentrism operating at the micro level of the family. The family unit fundamentally believes its specific way of thinking, voting, and worshiping is the only valid moral way to exist, and it forces assimilation through reward and punishment. This completely strips individuals of their unique roots, their questions, and their authentic selves.
In response to this, Dr. Parker advocates for a radical, paradigm-shifting move toward a multicultural family approach. A multicultural family, in her framework, is one that actively recognizes, tolerates, and eventually celebrates diverse beliefs within its own ranks.
It involves doing the incredibly hard work of acknowledging that family members can hold vastly different spiritual, agnostic, or secular worldviews, and choosing to find common ground built on shared humanity, mutual respect, and unconditional love, rather than enforcing rigid religious conformity as the price of admission to the family.
But we all know that to transition a family from forced assimilation to a multicultural dynamic, You have to establish incredibly firm boundaries. The family system will not change on its own. Homeostasis forbids it. Setting sacred boundaries is absolutely essential to surviving this process.
And Dr. Parker gives clear, actionable instructions here. Your boundaries must be proactive, not reactive. You don't wait for a family member to cross a deeply offensive line and then explode in anger. You define the line clearly, calmly, and ahead of time.
And you define it using specific I statements, which takes the focus off their behavior and puts it on your needs. Instead of saying, your religion is toxic, you are brainwashed, and I won't be part of it, which immediately triggers their defensive groupthink immune system, you say, I am no longer comfortable participating in these specific religious discussions, and I will be calmly excusing myself from the room when they occur. You state your truth and your intended action without attacking their worldview.
And here is a crucial piece of advice from Dr. Parker that I think everyone needs to hear. You must stop over-explaining and apologizing for your boundaries. When you set a boundary, the enmeshed family will demand a theological justification.
You do not need to provide one. You do not need to justify your existence or debate your need for emotional safety.
But precisely because this boundary-setting process is so incredibly draining, conflict-heavy, and isolating, Dr. Parker stresses the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of building external support systems.
You simply cannot navigate the relational minefield of a deconstructing religious family without a safe sanctuary completely outside of it. Whether it is a licensed therapist who specifically specializes in religious trauma and family systems, a structured support group of individuals undergoing a similar deconstruction journey, or deeply empathetic, non-judgmental friends, you need an external network to cushion the inevitable familial fallout.
You need objective people who can validate your reality and your sanity when your family system is actively, aggressively trying to gaslight you or undermine your perceptions.
Which finally, after all this dismantling and boundary setting, brings us to our destination. We are looking at reconstruction and the emergence of the sovereign self.
It is absolutely essential to emphasize, as Dr. Parker does in all her works, that deconstruction is not an ending. The goal of this agonizing process is not merely to violently tear down the sacred canopy and then stand shivering, cynical, and alone in the existential rain. Deconstruction is not about destruction for its own sake. It is a vital, necessary prerequisite for rebuilding a structurally sound life.
Yes. I love this pivot. You have to clear the rotting debris of the inherited identity and the borrowed morality so you can finally pour a foundation for a home that your soul can actually inhabit comfortably. And a major observable milestone in this reconstruction phase is what Dr. Parker famously calls living without permission.
Living without permission is the profound psychological and existential shift, where an individual finally stops translating their intrinsic truth through the distorted filters of family acceptance, religious fear, or inherited loyalty.
You stop waiting for external authorities, be it your parents, a pastor, or a community, to validate your choices. You stop over-explaining your life. You stop apologizing for your internal clarity.
And this is arguably the hardest part of the entire journey. You learn to tolerate being misunderstood. You deeply accept the painful reality that your family may never, ever understand your new path. They may always view you as a tragic cautionary tale, and you realize that their understanding is no longer a prerequisite for your inner peace.
With that internal authority firmly established, you can begin the beautiful work of cultivating a personal sacred canopy. Dr. Parker outlines 8 highly actionable, sequential steps for building a new, highly individualized spiritual or secular framework to guide your life. It begins with explore, engaging in deep, fearless self-reflection to discover what actually resonates with your core values, devoid of external pressure.
Then you engage. You intentionally read diverse philosophies, you look at different cultural traditions, you study science or humanism, and you actively expand your worldview far beyond the narrow, fearful lens you were raised with. Next is practice. This means incorporating tangible habits like mindfulness, meditation, journaling, or simply spending quiet time in nature experiencing a sense of grounding and connection directly, rather than through the highly prescribed, heavily mediated religious rituals of your past.
The 4th step is connect, which reiterates the absolute need to build a chosen family, a community of like-minded, supportive individuals for mutual inspiration and accountability. Following that is open. Your new personal spirituality or life philosophy must be inherently flexible. It must remain open to new experiences, new data, and be willing to adapt as you continue to grow. It must never become as static and rigid as the canopy you just escaped.
Then you have to integrate it. You don't just hold a neat philosophy in your head as an intellectual exercise. You live your newly chosen values daily. You practice radical gratitude, tangible kindness, and deep alignment in your ordinary, everyday actions. And crucially, step 7 is question. You must actively embrace doubt as a virtue, not a sin. Your personal sacred canopy must heavily encourage critical thinking, ensuring you never blindly fall into another groupthink trap or cult of personality.
And finally, the eighth step is maintain. This is the quiet recognition that authenticity is a continuous, lifelong journey of calibration, not a final, static destination you reach and never think about again. Through these rigorous steps, you build what Dr. Parker profoundly calls the architecture of integrity.
The architecture of integrity. This is the ultimate transition we've been tracking today. You are moving away from borrowed morality, which, as we established, was really just social obedience designed to avoid punishment and secure group belonging to true, unshakable internal integrity. You are finding your life's purpose and moral direction through deep internal resonance, rather than fulfilling a heavy collective obligation.
It is the absolute embodiment of personal sovereignty.
And I want to remind you, the listener, of something incredibly powerful and hopeful from the conclusion of Dr. Parker's work. The self that ultimately emerges from this grueling, messy process of deconstruction and reconstruction is not a fragile, wounded thing. It is highly sovereign. It is deeply anchored in clarity. And it is finally, perhaps for the first time in your life, capable of building and sustaining relationships based on genuine mutual respect and shared humanity, rather than fear-based conformity and conditional love.
It is, in essence, the pure self that existed before the world ever told you who you had to be to survive.
What an incredible, heavy, but ultimately liberating journey. Okay, let's bring this deep dive to a close. Today we've unpacked the immense, suffocating weight of the sacred canopy. We talked at length about how the nervous system subtly and then aggressively protests when we are forced to perform a borrowed self. We navigated the incredibly messy, explosive relational work of differentiation, pulling apart the enmeshed threads of religious family systems and confronting the chicken or egg dilemma. And we tracked the path through the minefield of holidays and boundaries, all the way to the quiet, powerful confidence of the reconstructed sovereign self.
It is a profound, heroic trajectory from recognizing the invisible boundaries of the cage to building a truly authentic, self-determined life.
And to you listening, wherever you are on the spectrum, we want to reiterate, navigating deeply entrenched family dynamics during a profound faith shift is undeniably one of the hardest, most courageous things a human being can undertake. It disrupts your most fundamental sense of safety and belonging, but it is ultimately a necessary journey of reclaiming your authentic architecture. It is agonizing, but it is worth the work.
As we conclude our analysis today, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something to explore in your own quiet moments as you navigate your own social agreements. Ask yourself this. If you were to completely stop performing for the comfort of the collective tomorrow, what is the very first social agreement your body would ask you to break?
A brilliant, necessary question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Parker's transformative work. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you next time.